What's going on, everybody? This is probably going to be my last kind of tabletop knife video of the year. I do plan on still putting out a sharpening video I mentioned last video, but I kind of wanted to tie things up for the ending of the year. Honestly, I'm not necessarily huge in the whole, New Year resolution. Let's change this, let's change that. I believe you change as you see the need for change. You recognize things as they need to be recognized, etc. But in general, there have been some things that happened recently. Like for one of my buddies asked me to pick what would be my top 5 knives of this year, and that kind of led me down a whole path of thinking, because it has been a pretty crazy year, and there have been some pretty crazy things that have happened. So I'm gonna kind of talk about everything and how I got to these knives here on the table, which are the knives that I bought this year. There happen to be 6. This knife, actually, I've talked to one of my buddies and I'm pretty sure he's gonna buy this knife. So I guess if you want to say what are my top 5, I guess you could say these are my top 5 by default. These are the knives, the modern knives that I bought this year and that I still have. If you take a step back and look at the shirt that I just put out here, the proud member of the HRC police. So I was minding my business at the beginning of the year, early on in the year, and Steve Kalari hit me up and we started talking, and he mentioned something to me about or maybe I was listening to one of his videos, and he mentioned something about a group chat that he was part of, and they talked about steel and this, that, and the other, and I'm always up for learning new things. So I said, we were talking back and forth already at that point. I said, hey man, I heard about your group chat in the video. I want to, what's the chat about? So he added me to the chat. Anyway, long story short, that led to me just being part of the group like anybody else, which led to me buying a Benchmade bailout. And one of the guys in there, Kurt, J Cool G 219, I always screw it up, it'll be down below. He hit me up and said, hey man, I'd really be interested in testing that knife out. At this point, I was not part of the testing thing, didn't necessarily have an interest in being part of the testing thing directly. Was just taking the information in. I was just observing, I was just learning, talking about things I know, learning about the things they knew, so on and so forth. Well, that led to the bailout coming back at, oh man, and I'm probably going to goof the number here, but anyway, it was at a number that showed me why that knife performed the way it did when I did simple things like stab an aluminum popcorn tin. That kind of made me take a step back and look at everything a little bit differently with knives, which if you look here, you'll probably see a little bit of a trend. But in that process, and I want to take the time to add the drop right here, in that process, there's been a lot of conversation around this steel thing, and we've been dubbed the
Keystone cops.
Yeah, I think that's kind of funny. So I'm going to use that drop from time to time. So expect to hear it. Shout out to Apostle P, by the way. Anyway, that leads me to how I ended up settling on these knives, or gravitated towards knives of this ballpark, let's say. So I'm going to go from my right to the left, which is also your right to the left because of how I'm filming. I found myself wanting a Tanto. I specifically wanted a Strider SMF Tanto, which I had sold off some time back, and I wanted to replace that knife. But as you guys know, those old school Tantos are not hard to come by, but because the old profile is out of production, they still make Striders, they still make Tantos, they still make SMF Tantos. It's just some weird new profile that I'm not a fan of, which again, I'm always accused of being a Strider fanboy. That's my honest opinion. I don't like that new profile. So I ended up buying this in the meantime, which I picked up for $300. And I've talked a lot about hidden value on this channel over the past year. And actually, Kenny in the Pockets, he did a video today that kind of talks about that same concept as well. But when I saw this knife for $300, it's more of that profile that I want, much more of an American Tanto, meaning that this point is much more, is much less of an angle like this. It's much more obtuse. Overall, I jumped on it because it was $300. So I picked this knife up and I knew that it needed to be sharpened. I knew that it had some scratches on the blade. You can kind of see there. You can kind of see on this side, but I didn't really care because I was going to use this knife, and I also knew it needed to be sharpened. But knowing that this is a CRK, I knew I could send it in, and for, I think it's like $20 or something like that, they would do a spa treatment on the knife, sharpen it, go through the internals, replace anything that needed to be replaced, reblast the handles, etc., etc., etc. If worst came to absolute worst, I don't know what the blade for an Zahn is, but I know for a Sabenza it's like $130. So if I was into the knife for $300, even if I still had to buy a new blade, I knew that this knife was still going to be less than a brand new retail knife. So I ended up picking this knife up, and it's been a great knife. I do like it. I do find that if you're going to fiddle with the knife, if you're a quote unquote collector that's going to fondle your knives a lot, this tab is a little bit sharp on the edge right here, and it will kind of dig into your finger if you're constantly opening and closing the knife. But I've found very little issue with this knife, and I've really enjoyed it a lot. It's really been a nice addition to the collection. And part of why I came back to CRK, which you can see there are two other CRKs here, is we know that CRK has an eye for detail, and they pay attention to the machining. They pay attention to the processing of the titanium, the sourcing of the titanium. They've developed the S35VN in conjunction with Crucible. They take great care to make sure that this is treated very well, so it performs very well. It's one of the best, regarded as one of the best S35s out there. So that is what drew me back to the Zahn overall and CRK in general. The next knife was kind of a surprise. 2018 blade, I picked up the Freak, and I really didn't like it. It had those rubberized grips. There was nothing about it that stood out to me. I don't love axis locks. You know, you pretty much, you name it. We've already talked about the bailout thing. So I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Benchmade. And if you remember, I did send them the email, and then I did ask them some questions trying to communicate, and the response was a little bit less than what I would deem to be desirable. But anyway, I came across one of these on the secondary for $130 from a buddy of mine, and Adam, and I'll just shout him out. I won't use his last name, even though he puts it in his username. But Adam had this knife up for sale, and it was $130. With that said, it does have a few issues. It does have some side to side and some up and down. But again, the knife has not been taken apart. The warranty is pretty good with Benchmade. So A, I wasn't buying directly from Benchmade, so I wasn't directly putting money in their pocket. B, it was a good price. And C, once I got it and found out it did have a few issues, I knew that I could send it in because it hadn't been taken apart, and they would take care of it for me. I haven't sent it in because it hasn't really been a major issue for me, but this knife has really been a surprise for me. It's in M4 steel. Let's see if we can get that to focus. M4 steel, which is a tool steel. And if you guys follow this channel, you know that I'm a big fan of tool steel. So that already had me won over a little bit. It has these G10 handles with the red liners and the red spacers. I don't necessarily care about the red liners and the red spacers. I don't necessarily feel like FRN is cheap. However, this knife feels solid, feels very solid. It doesn't have that super bulbous feel of the Griptilian, because this is also usually compared to the full-size Griptilian, and that is my one gripe about the full-size Griptilian, or any Griptilian, is it's got that big bulbous broomstick bushcraft-like handle, and I just don't like it. This has those edges kind of knocked off, and it's much more flat. So I like that. I also like the fact that even actuating this access lock with one of the sides that are exposed, you don't get any wobble. It doesn't stick, none of that stuff. It feels very, very solid. So I really enjoyed that a lot about the knife. And then kind of a common theme that you'll pick up on, several of these were tested, not only hardness tested, but cut tested. I cut test this one, which is why you can see it's worn off right here. The coating is worn off right here. And not only were the numbers good, but the testing, the actual cut testing, was very impressive. I believe this knife for me did 400-ish feet of cardboard. So that's a crazy number for any production knife. So this knife has been kind of the sleeper pick that I didn't even have an eye out for, but it just came across my path. Up next, I'm kind of cheating here. I said these were all knives that I bought originally, new this year, hadn't necessarily owned before or hadn't owned before, which is true for all of these knives here. This knife, technically, I have owned before. I've owned several XM18s in the 3.5-inch variant. I have not owned a Gen 6, and I have not owned a non-flipper. So as you can see, this is a non-flipper. This also, if you know what that means, is a Gen 6. Now, if you go back to my video, and it's in my Hinderer playlist, if you go back to my video, you'll see that when I got this knife, it came with bearings, because all these knives come on bearings. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, because I picked this up at a shop that's fairly local to me, and it was about a 50-minute drive. So after about 20 or 30 minutes of flipping this in the car, I noticed that it started to rub against one of the scales. So I was like, what in the world is going on? Well, come to find out, the pivot had no Loctite, so it had loosened up on me. Well, when I got home and I realized that and I tightened it up, this is like week before Blade, something like maybe a few days before Blade. I think I picked this up on a Monday and I was heading out on a Friday for Blade. So I didn't have time to really tear it down, swap the bearings out for Teflon or for phosphor bronze washers, any of that stuff. So I just kind of snugged it down, threw some Loctite in my bag, and I went to Atlanta. Well, what I noticed was that with the bearings in, no matter how tight I made the pivot, either it was going to be off center because I had tightened it up too much, or it just had side to side play with those bearings in there. Now, what I did was I swapped these out for phosphor bronze, and you can see it's incredibly smooth still. Not phosphor bronze, I'm sorry, the nylon washers, and it's still incredibly smooth, but a lot of that play is gone. And I do say a lot, there is still some play in this knife. So, you know, there's been some talk about, and I don't have a Strider on the table, I do have CRK. There's been some talk about what's the better knife of Hinderer, Strider, CRK as far as fit and finish, manufacturing tolerances, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, my Gen 6, I can't say that it's better than a CRK. And I also bought a new version SNG this year, but I had one last year, so I didn't put it on the table. Or my SNGs that I've bought this year and last year, or in general, since Mick took over all of the production from his Mick Strider custom shop. So the knife is okay. I've just never been a fan of the XM18 platform. So my friend hit me up today. He says he wants the knife. I think I'm just going to go ahead and sell it off to him, and I think I'm just going to be done with the XM18 platform. Honorable mention, and it's not on the table. Well, actually, I got it in my pocket right here. Honorable mention would go to this knife, which would have absolutely been on the table if I would have gotten this knife this year. This is the Hinderer Fire Attack, and it has none of those issues that I just mentioned. And this knife is just, I can't say enough about it. And now 5 people that I've mentioned this knife to have bought this knife, and all of them have fallen in love with this knife. So if you are looking for a Hinderer, I would look at this. They go for pretty cheap on the secondary. I think one of my friends just picked one up for under $300 the other day. I would seriously check this knife out. Anyway, on to the next knife. This was probably one of the first knives I picked up, after all of the hardness stuff and all of that, and I kind of started to distance myself from some of the other brands. And if I look through my collection, which I have, or I should say rotation, because I don't collect, as you can kind of see here by this knife and the other knives I picked up, I use them. So if I look through my rotation, I kind of got away from a lot of the 75, 80 to 150-ish dollar production knives that I've had in the past. And that's just because you start to realize that you're getting what you're paying for. And are these things bad? Not necessarily, but are there things that out there, even like this, that are in that price range that are better if you know what you're looking for, in the sense of, we're using knives, we want to cut, what knife is going to provide me with the best cutting performance, meaning grind, durability, wear resistance, so on and so forth. So I'll leave that there. This knife, the Impinda, I had been eyeing this knife. I really didn't like the knife. I didn't like the looks of it. I handled it at Blade. Again, that was Blade 2018. Just didn't like it a lot. But this year, the market was kind of stale. I really was put off by a lot of things because of, again, all the stuff I've already mentioned. And I was looking for a knife. I like traditional knives. This was a knife that came up available that usually was pretty hard to get. So I said, you know, if I buy it, they were going for, on the secondary, they were going for exactly what they were retail. So I was like, if I don't like it, I could just sell it, get my money back, no big deal. This knife here has become one of my favorite knives of the year. It's just, it cuts well, it holds an edge well, it is small, the pull is not weak like on a lot of the modern traditionals, the ergonomics are good, it's got a nice point to the blade. This knife just, it does everything. It even has a pocket clip if you're a pocket clip guy, or if you want to take this clip off and you want to put the filler tab in, it also comes with that. So again, that's just showing that eye for detail that CRK has. They even have developed a new locking system in here. There's not a half stop or anything like that. There's actually like a differential system where there's a different amount of pull weight depending on opening and or closing, or where you're at in the pull in general. So this also is a knife that's high on my list, very high on my list. This right here, I had always seen these Umnandis, but I had never picked one up. And finally, again, things were kind of slow, things were kind of stale. I knew CRK had an eye for detail. I knew I hadn't had one of these. I knew I kind of wanted some knives that were going to fit into my work life and be able to be carried in an office setting. The Umnandi fit that bill nicely. And I'll tell you, I haven't carried this knife a ton, but again, as you can see, I have carried it. It has been used. But this is a nice knife. I do wish, this is one of the newer models, so I do wish it kind of had that lip on the nail nick thumb pull here that the old ones had, so you can get more traction. But overall, even in my extra large hand, 4.5 inch palm, I can get 4 fingers on here comfortably for a knife of this size and this intended use case. And I can just use this knife without any type of issue. It is a little bit thick behind the edge, but nothing too crazy. Has that nice point, so you can pierce things if you need to. It does have those nice Macassar ebony handles, or covers on a traditional, but handles on this, and inlays on this. And it is a frame lock. Now, the one thing I will say is the frame lock, it's not too difficult to disengage, but it's firm enough where, and if you've handled CRK knives, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about. It's firm enough where you don't really know exactly where you're at in the disengagement until you hit against that inlay on the other side, which also acts as an over travel stop. So it's a good knife. I don't have any complaints. It's definitely something I'm glad I finally picked up. One of the things that kind of blew me away is how light this knife is. And I'm not usually a guy that likes a light knife, but this knife, it was shockingly light when I picked it up. So that was pretty interesting. And that leads me over here to my last knife, which I I've talked a good bit about this knife, more so in the sense of showing me using it and talking about my experience using this knife, because I've only had this since Thanksgiving, so it's only been about a month in full. Oh, this is the Hogue XL1 4-inch version with aluminum handles. But Hogue is a company that reached out to me, and honestly, I had seen Hogue before. I was familiar with Hogue, but I've even been by their booth at Blade before, but I had never really looked at them because the aesthetics of a good bit of their line didn't draw my eye. So after kind of talking with Neil, after seeing some, you know, different things from them, hearing about their process, hearing about their attention to detail, the fact that they've been so willing to work with me and the
Keystone cops,
it was just a good situation, and I was more than willing to pick one of these up with my own money. Speaking of, the giveaway is done. I'm sure Hogue has reached out to whoever won. I'm not quite certain. If I think about it before too long, I'll email Amanda and I'll ask her about the details on that so you guys can know too. But this, the EXO1, I've done a couple of videos about this. Again, there's a whole playlist now. I've done some stuff on my YouTube channel. I mean, my Instagram page, I'm sorry. And I just like this knife. I just do. I've compared this knife to the Microtech SOCOM, and a lot of people will say, I don't see it. I don't get it. I don't, you know, Hogue, I don't really know a lot about them. Hogue is a smaller company, so on and so forth. But it's got, it's only 154 cm, only 154 cm, but this 154 cm has been processed very well, and it's even been hand finished. So this edge is not burnt, and this steel has been treated appropriately for what it is. So I've beaten this knife through knots and wood. I've carved wood. I've batoned with this knife. I stabbed open a beer bottle. I cut the beer cap. From cutting the beer cap, you can't even see it. And I'm under some bright lights now, but you can't even see any rolls or nicks or anything like that in the blade. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, a roll or a nick will show up as a bright, shiny spot on the edge of the blade. Now what you're seeing there is this edge is actually polished from the factory, which is one thing that I probably would change, but that's easy enough to change after the first sharpening. But anyway, the lock sticks just a hair, but it's not really a big deal for me. I did have to take the pocket clip off in order to adjust this, because you have to adjust this screw to tighten the pivot, but the pivot tightened right up. The blade was centered. There was no more play. There was play after I kind of beat on it, and I noticed just a hair of play when I first got the knife, but I think that's because the pivot loosened and there's no Loctite here, so I didn't put Loctite, but that is what it is. But yeah, it's roughly about 20 thousandths behind the edge, so it's right in that general ballpark of your paramilitary 2s, your Griptilians, pretty much any knife you can think of. The SOCOM, depending on the model, depending on the batch, I guess I should say, there are some that are a little bit thinner, some that are about the same, some that are, you know, they're about the same. So this is a tough knife, done well, by a small American made company, but this also is a knife that is only $180. And when we're comparing this to something like a SOCOM, and I like Microtech, shout out to Jason McCoy. Didn't catch you at Blade this year, but you know I'll catch you next year, man. But comparing that to a Microtech SOCOM is, I think, $275, $250, somewhere in that ballpark, maybe a little bit more. This is $180. So we're talking about, let's call it, it's $75 cheaper than the other knife, but it's done at least as well. I think this is a very, to use a gag word I hate, compelling option that almost demands you take a look at it if you're looking at a knife like a Microtech SOCOM. So, and one other thing that I've tried a few times this year is tip down carry, which has thrown several people off. I did have a Microtech SOCOM, but as you can see, it's no longer around. So that kind of takes care of my year, how I got to these knives. Appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below as always. And remember, a lazy man carries a dull knife.